At the halfway point of this parliamentary term, the government moves to seize back the agenda with a big shift on climate and energy policy, new laws to boot out terrorists and a plan to rein in soaring migration numbers. But the opposition's determined to keep the focus on what it says are Labor's national security failures. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. It's been a tough few weeks for the government, but the advantage of being in office is the power to set the agenda. On Thursday, a dramatic expansion of subsidies for renewable energy and storage was announced, aimed at putting climate targets back on track. Today, new anti-terror legislation aimed at fixing coalition-era laws that were knocked out by the High Court. With the last full week of Parliament for the year about to begin, Labor wants to be in control. The opposition, though, wants to keep the heat on the government over national security and border security. Peter Dutton has attacked the granting of temporary visas to hundreds of Palestinians trying to flee Gaza. He's worried the security checks haven't been stringent enough. It comes as more hostages are released by Hamas as part of the temporary ceasefire deal with Israel. Just in the last hour, a further 17 hostages made it through the Rafah crossing, but only after last-minute wrangling involving the US president and Qatar.
There are schools being bombed actively in Gaza and those students can't learn, so why should we?
School students should be at school during school hours.
I've spoken to Jewish students who are so anxious about going to school, about getting on the school bus.
The Prime Minister has vowed to put an end to rising anti-Semitism across Australia.
In a rare show of political unity, Anthony Albanese shoulder to shoulder with the opposition leader.
We stand here today in the wake of the barbarity visited upon Israel on the 7th of October.
As the conflict continues, anti-Semitism is on the rise, but we will not let it find as much as a foothold here.
We begin with a major breakthrough in the Israel-Hamas war.
Israel's cabinet has approved a deal that would see the release of some hostages from Gaza.
50 women and children will be released over a period of 4 days, during which there will be pauses in fighting.
How significant is this?
Enormously significant for the families of hostages who are returning.
I just want to see the children come back. We want all of them to come back.
But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has made it clear the war will go on.
We will continue to fight. Continue to fight until we reach all our goals.
The Australian government has confirmed it's approved hundreds of visas for people caught in the war.
Can you guarantee their backgrounds have been checked?
These people have been subjected to the normal security and identity checks.
There's a whole lot of red flags that we should be worried about this.
Well, these are not permanent visas.
The Australian government has no presence on the ground in Gaza, obviously. There is no functioning state or government in Gaza. To the extent it is, it's run by a terrorist organisation.
Why would the coalition have any problem with trying to get people out of harm's way?
If the Prime Minister is not conducting adequate security checks on people coming out of a war zone into our country who can seek protection and stay here permanently, then I think the Prime Minister's lost the plot.
The first Israeli hostages have been released in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners.
This is a complex moment for a traumatised nation.
It's kind of exciting but also sad, and we want everybody to come home as soon as possible.
And my guest this morning is the Climate Change and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen. First, let's check what's making news. 13 Israeli hostages have now been released by Hamas on day 2 of the temporary ceasefire with Israel. Only hours ago, Hamas was threatening to delay the release, accusing Israel of failing to uphold its end of the deal. But US President Joe Biden intervened, speaking to the Emir of Qatar, who helped get the agreement back on track. A short time ago, a number of Red Cross vehicles crossed from the Gaza Strip into Egypt. 4 foreign nationals have also been released by Hamas in the last hour. Australia is closing in on reaching its 2030 climate targets. The government's released new modelling showing emissions will be 42% lower, just shy of its 43% target. The projections improved due to the new policy announced on Thursday to expand subsidies for renewable and storage projects. We'll talk to the Minister Chris Bowen about that shortly. In the Sunday Herald Sun, international students will be taxed and their numbers capped under a plan being considered by the government to cut soaring migration numbers. James Campbell reports the plan is under active consideration to be included in the migration strategy that's due to be unveiled next month. And finally, the government will this week introduce legislation to Parliament aimed at fixing coalition-era anti-terror laws that were knocked out by the High Court. The laws allow dual nationals engaged in terrorism to be stripped of their Australian citizenship. Under the revamped legislation, the power to strip that citizenship will be given to a court rather than the minister. I understand the laws will also apply to those engaged in espionage and acts of foreign interference. Now, the agreement to pause fighting in Gaza was certainly welcomed by the Australian government. After all, it was Foreign Minister Penny Wong on this program 2 weeks ago who called for steps towards a ceasefire, including greater restraint from Israel in attacking hospitals and the release of hostages by Hamas. But that doesn't mean this gets any easier from here. Even if this temporary truce does hold, Israel's vowed to resume its campaign to destroy Hamas once it's over. The Albanese government's carefully balanced support for Israel will again be tested. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by James Campbell, Anna Henderson and James Massola. Very good morning to all of you. Let's start with what's been happening in the last hour or two with the release of these hostages. 13 Israelis, 4 foreign nationals have made it through the Rafah crossing. But James, where we were a few hours before that, this whole thing looks shaky, it looks tenuous, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're not getting on well, are they? I mean, there's the level of trust between both sides is not what it might be. You know, the Israeli government has really effectively been having the hostages' families sitting at the cabinet table, and it's made it very difficult. On the one hand, it's trying to prosecute a war. On the other hand, it's dealing with public opinion, which is very anxious, quite reasonably, that they should get their citizens back. This isn't on, you know, if you were being cold-blooded about this isn't a great deal for Israel. They've agreed to the release of a whole bunch of people who they would clearly much rather keep in prison, and they've got there's history here. Israel has in the past been prepared to release, you know, many hundreds of its enemies, who've then, in many cases, gone on to continue.
One of them, leader of Hamas.
One of them is now the leader of the military wing of Hamas. So, you know, it's not.
But you're right to point out that Netanyahu's under a lot of pressure to do this, to do whatever it takes to get those hostages out. And look, we'll see whether it does hold for the next. It's meant to be 4 days, but potentially, and continuing beyond that, if Hamas releases more hostages. The one thing that's very clear, though, is Benjamin Netanyahu, once Hamas stops releasing any more hostages, wants to resume the conflict. Here he was.
So I would like to make it clear, we are at war and we will continue the war. We will continue the war until we achieve all our objectives. Eliminate Hamas, return all our abductees and missing persons, and ensure that there will be no element in Gaza that threatens Israel.
Ensuring there's no element in Gaza that threatens Israel could take some work, could take some time. How do you think the Australian government's going to feel about Israel resuming the conflict?
It's a very uncomfortable situation for the Australian government, and certainly while we have seen obviously some sense of relief around what's unfolded in the last couple of hours on both sides. Not only has there been this continuing concern and this tide of public opinion internationally about whether Israel has gone too far, and the way that a hospital was targeted most recently, the justification for it, whether that can continue to be upheld by Western allies. We know that the US government has been putting pressure on Israel to try and turn down the temperature here and to allow some kind of truce, even in a short term.
Well, the fact that Joe Biden had to intervene in the last few hours to help push this along tells us that, doesn't it?
And just the language that's been used by the Israeli government about, the attempts to deal with Hamas wherever it needs to, it still sends those absolute chills down the spines of everyone in the Palestinian territories or people in Australia with family there, the wider community, about what that means for, the potential for other people to be impacted, killed, injured, left without anywhere to go. And for the Australian government, they're dealing with a situation in this country where different groups are now on the streets, as we've seen for a number of weeks, trying to raise awareness and concern about their communities. We had the last sitting of Parliament where this was red hot as an issue and caused the Prime Minister to perhaps be at his most angered about the way he was being criticised by the opposition on the issue of anti-Semitism. I don't think that's going to go away when Parliament resumes.
Meanwhile, Australia has granted, nearly 1,800 temporary visas to Israeli citizens and about 860 to Palestinians trying to get out of Gaza. Clearly, not many of them have been able to get out. But this raised a concern for Peter Dutton. He's worried that not enough security vetting has taken place.
To take people out of Gaza through a desktop search from a person in Canberra in the Immigration Department without the requisite security checks being undertaken is reckless. And it's also dangerous. I know the time that it takes. You can't reach into the US system and get these checks back overnight.
James, the government, though, argues all the normal standard security checking has taken place, including not just the Immigration Department, but through ASIO and other agencies. What's Peter Dutton basing this on?
Look, I think he's pressing on that same nerve that we've seen him pressing on in the last couple of weeks in terms of concerns about the people who are detained that were released by the High Court. I think what he's doing, or what he's targeting here, if you like, David, feeds into concern about Labor not being able to keep the borders secure, Labor potentially letting people into the community that they shouldn't. It's in that frame, if you like.
Yeah,
now, it's questionable whether it's actually realistic. If you think back to Ukraine, for example, when that war kicked off, we started bringing in Ukrainian refugees. We'd closed our embassy at that point. There's, the same desktop searches were taking place. Now,
does anybody really think, though, that refugees from the Ukraine were potentially security risks the way people from Gaza are?
No, but if there's 1.8 million people living in Gaza when that the Israeli security situation kicked off, not all of them are terrorists. In fact, I'd put the vast majority are not.
No,
and that's
true. But they are
what we're
also,
taking is a tiny fraction of those.
It is also an unfortunate truth that they're unlikely to hold sanguine views about Jews. We've seen, from the recent behaviour from people in crowds in Australia, people don't leave those sorts of attitudes when they hit the check-in.
Yeah, but that's assuming as well that people who would come to Australia under this program on a tourist visa for maybe 12 months as members of extended family, you're making a lot of assumptions.
Do you really think they're going home?
Well, how do you know they're not? I mean, often people do want to return home.
There may not be much home to go back to, but I think what the government needs at the moment, it will be desperately hoping it emerges at some point, is what Israel's plan is for after it has defeated Hamas. The problem at the moment is that, okay, they're smashing Hamas, this is provoking a lot of emotional responses, reasonably. Once Israel makes it clear that there is something in the future, there's a route to normalisation, to safety, to rebuilding the place, I think that the pressure on the government here will diminish.
If we go back to those first principles of what a country like Australia does when there is a war going on and they try to open their doors to at least assist some people in a war zone to get out and give them some kind of safe haven, at least for a short period of time. The question, I guess, for the government is, were they obliged to help in some way. And I think the way Ed Husick described it as sort of crass from Peter Dutton.
There's a very strong view within the government that this, sort of mirrors Peter Dutton's language over the years on Lebanese migration, on African gangs, on. But the Abbott government took in 12,000, was it, refugees fleeing ISIS from Syria, and they were given permanent.
They were almost all Christians.
But they were, but they were all given permanent refugee status. So these are only temporary visas. Sure, some of them may want to stay beyond that, but it's not unprecedented that we don't give a home to.
Yeah, some of them may want to stay here rather than going back to the Gaza Strip. It's possible that some of them will want to go home.
But what I'm saying is that's not inconsistent with the way we've dealt with people fleeing war zones. We gave 12,000 to people fleeing ISIS, and they were permanent positions, weren't they?
Yep. The reality is, in terms of Israel's security operation, and the government will be watching this very closely, of course, governments around the world are, they'll be nervous. There'll be extreme concern in government ranks that what Netanyahu said, he will follow through, that action will resume in 2 or 3 days' time. We will likely mimic whatever Joe Biden says. Biden's saying he's very hopeful that this security this hostilities pause will continue. It probably won't. But Israel, and we see this time and time again over the decades, Israel's licence to operate, if you like, its licence to take these security actions is stamped by the US. We will get to a point, it might be in a couple of weeks, it might be in a couple of months, where the Biden administration says, okay, enough. They effectively forced Israel's hand in terms of this pause. Don't forget, this plan, this deal was offered a month ago, and Netanyahu said no, they weren't ready at that point. We will get to a point where this has to stop again, and it'll be the US that makes that call in concert with its allies.
Just to your point that Peter Dutton is obviously looking for any opportunity to put pressure on the government over national security, border security too. A boat arrived on the Australian mainland the other day.
Target-rich environment for him at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it sure is, isn't it?
This boat with people who were then quickly flown out to Nauru for offshore processing, but it was the first one to make it to the mainland of Australia in quite a while. The coalition said in about 10 years. Turns out it's about 5 years. The last one was actually in far north Queensland in 2018, and it turns out it was just a couple of days after Scott Morrison had taken over from Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister. Peter Dutton had just become Home Affairs Minister, and there was a terrific photo, in fact, this was it, of one of the locals sharing a beer and giving a ride on his tinny to one of the asylum seekers who just rocked up there at the mouth of the Daintree River. Nonetheless, while not blaming the government, of course, back then for that boat arrival, Peter Dutton is blaming the government now for this one.
They've watered down many of the policies that we had in place which stopped the boats, and now, once again, the boats have started under a Labor government.
Anna, has Labor watered down the border, the Operation Sovereign Borders, as he suggests?
Well, I think that's a matter of your position on the issue, because if you are in the opposition ranks, and they had some incredibly draconian ways of operating, offshore processing was, a huge feature of their policy. There have been changes, some of them not by government, also by the High Court, for example, about what happens to people who try to come to this country, by boat. But if you were trying to write a script for the opposition about a set of circumstances that would help them to regain control of the agenda right now, this would be kind of the icing on the cake to their ability to now walk back into Parliament and really prosecute this argument that the government is not able to keep control of that issue, which we know over a huge period of time has been one of the most contentious and difficult issues in the Parliament.
Labor has, after coming to office, I think it was at the early part of this year, removed temporary protection visas for those already on them in Australia. Any new arrivals like this boat, they get sent offshore, or they get turned back, as a bunch of others. I think there have been 10, haven't there, since the election. Most of them turned back, but this one managed to get through, and then they go off to offshore processing. Is it clear, do you think, James, that there's any particular uptick or pull factor happening at the moment?
Depends who you talk to. Some people think that the changing end of the temporary protection visa regime is a pull factor. The answer to this really is we won't know unless we get a raft of, if there's a ton of boats come, then they've got a problem, right? 12 people turn up in Western Australia and get shipped off to Nauru. I suspect the public at this point are kind of like a bit of they're doing the full court press on it for the opposition, but it's not yet on people's radar. If there's a boat every week or every 3 or 4 days,
it's a different thing.
Then it's going to become a problem. So this is a watch and see situation.
And watch and see, you'd expect government through Border Force will be watching and seeing ramping up surveillance in the weeks ahead.
Massively. I mean, what Labor's done in government, David, so far, it's nothing like Chris Evans ending offshore processing, I think it was in 2009, July 2009. By September, October that year, we were seeing, a boat a week, basically. We're not seeing anything like that. That's not to say it won't happen, but I don't see that there's something that they've done as a government that's a pull factor in the same way. What matters now for Labor is how they respond to this. I mean, we have a vast coastline. It's impossible to stop the occasional boat slipping through, I'd suggest. But if Labor kind of goes to water, if they don't put on the hair shirt and the tough guy visage that the coalition did so well and say, right, no one's getting through, we're doing this, no messing around. If they don't do that, that's potentially a pull factor, to James's point before.
But they have a lack of transparency around this as well. We don't know when there's a surge necessarily in Border Force activity, exactly what's happening out there. And perhaps this is a time if the government wanted to sort of follow through on some of its election ambitions when it came to power around what it was going to do as a government. It would be interesting to be aware of more detail about what's happening out there so we know if this is just a once-off.
The last government, if you talk to anyone in the last government, the one thing they all agree on is there was too much detail out there about what was happening as the boats were arriving. That every journalist was just the emails arrived. They just seemed to. Sometimes you'd get 2 or 3 a day. It was terrible for them. I think whatever else happens, we'll be hearing as little about it as possible.
We'll be hearing on water matters once more. All right, we might return to how the government's going to handle the week ahead in Parliament as the year draws to a close. Time now to shift to climate change and energy and talk to the Minister, Chris Bowen, about the plans he unveiled during the week. To take us there, here was the Shadow Minister, Ted O'Brien, criticising the use of taxpayers' funds to underwrite investment in renewables.
Confidence has totally dropped from the private sector, and therefore what they are now saying is the taxpayer is going to underwrite things. How much that will cost, well, they're just refusing to tell us. Really what Labor is saying here is international capital isn't coming to Australia, so taxpayer, you have to cop it. You're paying for it. You're underwriting it. That's really what the government is saying here. Now, they might say it's a response to the Inflation Reduction Act and all of those types of things, but really it is a response to a failed policy. They're doubling down, but this time the Australian people have to pay for it.
Chris Bowen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, David. Good morning.
So this is a major change, using an undisclosed amount of taxpayers' dollars to underwrite the transition to renewables. Why weren't your previous policies adequate? Why did you need to do this?
I think it's a reflection, David, of what I've been saying for some time, that we were doing well, but not well enough. And both parties supported a capacity investment scheme at the last election. The Liberal Party couldn't deliver one. We have delivered one. We ran a pilot and that pilot worked very well. The auction I announced with Penny Sharp, the New South Wales Minister, this week, added more megawatts in one auction than the previous government delivered in 9 years. But in the face of the Inflation Reduction Act, a global race to capital, a global race for supply chain infrastructure projects, finding challenges all around the world, our planning systems coping in some cases not as well as they can with an increase in renewable energy applications. We did say this capacity investment scheme, which has worked very well, can now be, if you like, supercharged to do an even better and more important job. And why this is important, David, most particularly, is because as coal-fired power leaves, we need to get more renewable and dispatchable energy on to replace it before it leaves. Otherwise, we have a big threat to reliability in the system. The biggest threat to reliability in our energy system at the moment is unexpected outages of coal-fired power stations, and we need to get more energy on quicker. We need a transition which is more orderly and faster, and that's what we're delivering.
One of the big changes as part of this, though, previously this scheme was only for dispatchable power, so that had to include some storage, batteries, pumped hydro or whatever. Now that's not a requirement. You can now underwrite wind and solar projects alone. Why do they need taxpayer support? Why can't they stand up on their own?
Well, what we're doing is supplying a reliable and secure and welcoming investment environment for both dispatchable and variable renewable. We need both. Just as you need, you know, in any system, whether it's the water system or the electricity system, you need a range of capacities and availability. You need both. We're moving to a more renewable system. You do need dispatchable power. That means renewable energy supported by batteries or pumped hydro or some other form of support for peaking and firming. You also need the variable renewables, obviously, and the auctions will support both of those.
But is there a danger if the government's intervening like this, that you know, if you're supporting one wind farm and the other one doesn't have that taxpayer support, are they less likely to invest because their competitors got a government leg up?
Well, I think if you look at the response of the industry this week, you know, whether it is energy users, energy producers, climate groups, industry groups like the Australian Industry Group, they all strongly supported this move by the government this week. I think that shows that we've considered and consulted very widely. We have responded to the changing international circumstance. As I said, this is necessary for emissions reduction, absolutely. It's also vital for reliability. We saw 4 gigawatts of dispatchable power leave the grid under the coalition, only 1 gigawatt come on. It has left Australia quite vulnerable and we are moving to fix it.
Now, on the cost, I know you don't want to reveal exactly what you're willing to spend here because you've got to go into, you know, an auction process with the private sector. But one energy economist has suggested this could end up costing tens of billions of dollars. Can you at least give us a hint whether it's in that ballpark?
I wouldn't get carried away by some commentators here, David. But
so not tens of billions?
Well, I wouldn't get... that commentator has had no insight to our work. But just as the New South Wales support scheme, the LTESA, the Western Australian Capacity Mechanism, is commercial in confidence, just as the previous government's underwriting new generation policy, which was actually better termed, unfortunately, no generation involved scheme, the Youngie scheme, Angus Taylor said those details were commercial in confidence, just as their vaccine deals were commercial in confidence. When a government is entering into commercial negotiations or an auction, it is quite standard budget treatment to say that we will not indicate our pricing expectations as we're about to enter an auction. David, I think people understand that if you're conducting an auction for a house or attending an auction for a house, you don't tend to send an email saying, here's my bidding strategy. What we're determined to do is maximise the benefit for the taxpayer and keep those bidders with their pencils very sharp, and the way to do that is exactly the approach we're outlining.
But most people who go to an auction to buy a house will have, privately at least, a cap, a cost, an upper limit in mind. Can you at least tell us whether you have any sort of cap here internally as to how much you're willing to spend? Or is this uncapped?
Well, the advantage of an auction, David, as opposed to other options that are available to us, like extending the RED, is that the government is in control of the auction. We are in control of what bids we accept and what bids we decline. We're in control of how many gigawatts we call for in particular auction rounds, so that is one of the advantages. Obviously, we won't be subsidising negative prices, but we will be calling for the investors to come forward. We will be saying in that auction process, just as we did in the first round that I announced, a very successful round, adding more than a gigawatt in New South Wales, very important for the reliability gap in New South Wales. What is your minimum price that you need guaranteed, and what is your maximum price over which you will share your profits with the taxpayer?
But is your spending, is the taxpayer cost here capped or not?
Well, as I said, we're in control of the auction. You know, so we will accept the bids that we choose to accept and not accept other bids, and we will determine how many gigawatts we put out.
I'm just asking, though, Minister, if there's an upper limit to what you're willing to expose taxpayers to or not.
Well, David, as I said, in any corporate negotiations, commercial negotiations, you do not signal to bidders what your red lines are.
No, I'm
what
not
you do
asking
is
that.
say,
I'm asking within the government.
With respect, David, you are.
No, I'm not asking for the figure. No, I'm just wondering whether you have capped the amount you're willing to spend.
Well, of course, we have analysed how we expect these auctions to run. It will be treated in the budget statement of contingent liabilities and risks in a normal fashion. And that is, but this is the right policy for the right times to ensure emissions come down, reliability goes up.
It's helping to get you closer to the 43% emissions target, according to the modelling that you're releasing today and that will be tabled in Parliament this week. But you're not quite there. You're at 42 rather than 43%. So you've still got a bit more work to do?
Yes. Yes, and I'm pleased with what we've done so far, but not yet satisfied because the task is big. The targets we took the last election were ambitious but achievable, and I think what the figures that we're showing today are the updated projections, which show we are now on track for 42% emissions reduction by 2030, underpinned by the 82% renewable target plus other policy initiatives, shows that we have done well. We have more work to do. We want to get to 43%, and indeed we've always said we see that as a flaw to our ambitions, but it's ambitious. You know, Australia is coming at this 2030 target starting in 2022. Australia on climate policy is like the kid that forgot about the exam and has to really come home strongly in the final period. That's what we're doing in the Albanese government, making up for those 10 years of denial and delay and the pauses and the 26 energy policies and all the rest and getting on with the job.
You might be doing better on reducing emissions here, but the Australian Conservation Foundation's commissioned some analysis, and it shows that by approving new coal and gas projects in Australia, you're adding to global emissions. In fact, it says for every tonne of pollution that you've reduced, you're adding 7 tonnes through the approval of new coal and gas projects.
Let me make a couple of points, David. I've read through that report and I don't agree with their analysis of many of the projects. You know, we have, under our government, there have been some metallurgical coal developments. We need metallurgical coal for steel. You know, nobody can suggest that green steel isn't coming, but it's not here yet. There's been a very small gas expansion approved. But more broadly, let me make this point. The way I see this, David, is you can enter into a discussion with your international counterparts, as we are doing, which is us saying to them, we will continue to be a reliable energy supplier, but we want to work with you on your decarbonisation because we have advantages that you don't have. We can provide green hydrogen, we can provide renewable energy. Now, that is a complicated conversation to have, but an important one. Now, frankly, the approach of others is more a slogan than a policy. We are managing the biggest economic transformation in our country's history, and that involves both domestic policies and very strong engagement internationally, as I'll be doing in the next couple of weeks, as we've been doing all the way through. And it's not as simple as a blanket slogan, which I hear from the Greens, frankly, about their approach. We take a much more considered approach to policy development.
Which involves opening up new coal and gas.
Well, I mean, look, take the Greens' position on the gas code, which will come up for a vote tomorrow in Parliament. They want to rip up the one regulation on the gas industry, and they want to rip up the one thing which ensures that new supply comes domestically. Right. What the Greens are saying is open slather, open up more gas and export it when we have a looming gas shortage in 26-27, which the Greens just pretend doesn't exist. And now they are proposing to rip up the one policy which is dealing with it, which is the gas code.
I want to ask you about transmission lines. One of the big concerns when it comes to rolling out all these renewables is how to plug them in. And we know there's about 10,000 kilometres of transmission lines required for all of these big projects that are going ahead. A lot of community resistance to some of these projects. I think nearly all of them are facing some sort of pause or delay because of the community backlash. You want better consultation with communities, which sounds great. But at the end of the day, if they're not on board, will you still have to press on regardless with these transmission lines?
Well, I mean, these transmission lines are vital. They're in the integrated system plan as being integral to reliability again going forward. But of course, it's been a long time since Australia built a major transmission line, and the regulatory regime, the consultation rules weren't fit for purpose when we came to office, and we have moved and are continuing to move to improve them, because I want to bring communities with us. I'm not pretending that it's always going to be an easy conversation, but we are making progress on all those lines. I mean, the Hume Link, for example, is absolutely vital to plug in Snowy 2.0.
So you've still got to do it, even if the community's not on board?
Well, there's no point building Snowy 2.0, as the previous government started, with no plan to plug it in. We're coming along and plugging it into the grid. Now, yes, that involves conversations with communities. State governments are doing a good job. All three Eastern Coast governments, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, have very good landholder compensation packages, which ensures the landholder receive good payments for having transmission lines. But it's not just about landholders, it's also about communities. I want to see real community benefit. Now, we've changed some of the regulatory rules, including just in recent weeks. Those changes have taken effect. We've also asked Andrew Dyer, the Energy Infrastructure Commissioner, to advise us on other improvements we can make. He's done a very substantial number of roundtables and community meetings getting feedback, and we'll continue to progress that work.
Minister, a big question many households are asking, when will electricity prices start to come down?
Well, David, I'm encouraged by the wholesale price movements in recent weeks and months. You know, at points the wholesale price has been 71% lower than it was 12 months ago. Now, I know people don't pay wholesale prices, but they do flow through to retail prices in some form down the track. So we'll, of course, see the default market offer release in the draft release in February, but I do expect some of those much reduced wholesale prices, which are as a result of two things: the coal and gas caps the Albanese government put in place against the opposition of Peter Dutton, and the increase in renewables, particularly solar, playing a bigger role in setting the prices. We'll see that that default market offer be substantially less than we were dealing with last year in terms of the increase.
We know Labor promised lower prices. Will we get lower prices this term?
Well, of course, we indicated the impact of policies by 2025, something the opposition often forgets to weave into their convenient little narrative. We're dealing with, you know, very challenging international circumstances in the energy market, just as every country, every government in the world is doing. But I am encouraged by some of the wholesale price movements, very substantial reductions, which will ultimately flow through to retail bills in due course, of course, with the other factors that also flow into retail bills.
Look, just a couple of other things. The COP28 climate summit begins this week in Dubai. You're going to be there a little later in the summit. One of the big areas of focus is the multi-trillion-dollar loss and damage fund this year. This is to compensate vulnerable nations. What will Australia be contributing?
Well, it's not so much just to pick up on one thing. It's not about compensation, David. It's about supporting developing countries in dealing with the impacts of climate change, and they are the most vulnerable. And particularly, our focus has been to support the loss and damage fund, but to insist that it flows to small island developing states, i.e. the Pacific. There are plenty of funds in the world which don't flow to the countries like the Pacific. We have been insistent, and we've been very involved in the committee setting up the loss and damage scheme to say we want it to deal with the Pacific and countries, you know, similar in the Caribbean and elsewhere, but our focus is on the Pacific. Also, I've said, for example, that the contributing countries, which was set in 1992 in terms of the countries that contribute to these funds, it's time to have another look at that, because there are countries that weren't rich in 1992 that are rich now. Those conversations are ongoing.
Like China.
And others. Those conversations are ongoing. There's some further work to do on the loss and damage fund, but we have been very active and constructive internationally in those conversations.
A bunch of countries at the COP conference will be seeking to expand the use of nuclear power. The US, the UK, Sweden, France, and so on. Does Australia have any objection to that?
Well, we respect other countries' plans, but David, in Australia's context, nuclear for Australia is a fantasy wrapped in a delusion accompanied by a pipe dream. I mean, it is not the right solution for Australia. And I've seen some reports about the role of nuclear in the COP discussions. Those reporters might be in different conversations to the one I'm in. You know, the signature call of the COP presidency is a tripling of renewables and a doubling of energy efficiency, a call we support. It is not part of the COP negotiations in the way that it's been characterised. And you just got to look at the International Energy Agency's recent World Energy Outlook report. They show that renewables are reshaping the energy system around the world. 500 gigawatts of new renewables in 2023, $1 billion being added to solar. You know, and nuclear really not moving the dial at all. Okay. It is an attempt at distraction by the government, by Australia's chief climate inactivist, Peter Dutton, and we are not going to be distracted.
Just finally, Minister, before I let you go, more Israeli hostages have been released this morning, our time, as part of the temporary ceasefire arrangement there. We know this has been a big concern, this conflict, for many in your electorate in Western Sydney. What should happen when this ceasefire comes to an end?
Well, a very encouraging and welcome development we're seeing, David. And really this is what Penny Wong called for in this interview 2 weeks ago. Steps towards a ceasefire, recognising that both sides have obligations, recognising that every innocent life is equally valuable and sacred, whether it be Palestinian or Israeli. It's very good to see those Israeli hostages released. It's very good to see the ceasefire. And what, of course, everyone wants to see peace and moves to a two-state solution. I mean, of course we want to see that. Penny Wong has been very active in calling for what we've seen overnight, and I think that is a very encouraging development. And of course, we all want to see these arrangements become more permanent, because that is the pathway to peace for the Middle East and a two-state solution.
But Benjamin Netanyahu is clear. Once Hamas stops releasing hostages, he wants the conflict to resume, to continue pursuing Hamas. Will Israel be justified in doing that?
Well, we continue to call for steps towards a ceasefire, and the more enduring that ceasefire is, of course, the better the world is, the better the region is, the better the people of Palestine are. So, and ultimately, David, I believe that Israel can only really be secure and free when Palestine is secure and free, and ultimately that is our long-term objective.
Does Israel have any right to continue this conflict?
Well, Israel has always had rights, but also they have obligations under the the rules of war, and we continue to call for those obligations to be observed. And as I said, Penny Wong, I thought very articulately in this interview 2 weeks ago, outlined what she would like to see happen. I think what is happening is pretty close to what Penny Wong outlined, and of course we'll continue. You and I don't know what is about to happen in Middle East, David. Nobody really does. All we can do is express our principles, and our principles are very clear, and a ceasefire and the steps towards it have been a very encouraging development.
Chris Bowen, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, David.
All right, coming up, we're going to look at the midway point of this parliamentary term, how the government's faring and what its plans are for the coming few weeks. First, let's continue this conversation with our panel. Back to James Campbell, Anna Henderson and James Massola. Let's talk about the climate shift that was announced the other day by the Minister, and he's just explained a bit more about it then. James, I guess you would expect the opposition will be focused on the cost element here. You can understand, and he cites, what happened with vaccine deals and so on, government not tipping its hand on what it's willing to spend, but it's a little unclear whether there is a cap on this within the government.
It's a little unclear. Not a little unclear, it's completely unclear. I mean, if the government wants to essentially renationalise the electricity grid...
I don't think that's what they're talking about, to be fair. They're still privately owned.
They're privately owned, but if the money to build them's coming from the government or is being underwritten by the government, it is a backhanded sort of way of nationalising the grid, and that's not unreasonable.
They're not taking any ownership.
No, most that happens is that they take a profit when electricity prices reach a certain point above the expectation, and the contract
the taxpayer is going to pay for this, right? But the taxpayer built the coal-fired power stations that are being phased out as well. I mean, Australia's electricity grid was built and paid for by the government. So we shouldn't really get too worked up about that. The question is this the right way to do it? And what is clear from this is that the government is locking itself into a particular technology fix for this. That is the 2023 technology fix, right? These contracts are going to run for a long, long time. And we don't know what technology is around the corner, particularly in things like hydrogen, which could render this technology completely...
potentially
defunct.
They are putting billions into that, but green hydrogen's not there yet.
No, I'm not saying it is, but these are very long contracts in a space which things are moving very, very quickly. I mean, look, I've got an arts degree. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a technical person, but I do get a bit scared when governments won't tell me how much they're planning to spend on something.
Yeah, and most energy experts who do have those relevant degrees are pretty happy with what they've done here. It may not be the ideal if you were starting from scratch, but from where we are, most of them seem to think that this sort of risk, this assistance with the private sector in managing their risk is not a bad way to go.
Well, so what are they saying? They're saying obviously the government didn't have a good enough strategy to start off with. Obviously things have changed and the international situation has changed, but they needed to build some more support into the system. They were dealing with the United States now having the Inflation Reduction Act and bringing a lot of
capital
renewables and
the price of money's gone through the roof too. That's the other thing.
Yeah, and you can see how the IRA in the US is creating industries, and it is driving a lot of investment there. Australia's sort of watching on, trying to be involved, and there's this frustration amongst those who, again, also with an arts degree, I can look on and read the eminent professional advice here that we have, so much land available for for wind power and solar power. Why wouldn't we harness that over other technologies? One thing I think the government has underestimated in all of this is the amount of community pushback and how the National Party is harnessing that.
Well, let's talk about that, because I thought that was interesting with the Minister there, because, you know, moving from coal-fired power stations, which are very centralised, to having renewable projects dotted around, does require all these transmission lines.
Yeah.
And you're right, some communities are pushing back against that.
Hang on, communities. I actually think this is BS. I think that there is a very noisy, self-interested element who are against these.
Well, it's interesting you say that. It's interesting you say that.
When you talk to people who have, let's say, have done research, paid research, to go out into the wider communities in which these transmission lines are going in, you get a very, very different response.
You might have spoken to the same people as me, because
divided.
as I understand it, the NFF, the Farmers Federation's done some surveying on this and polling on this. Now, the results are interesting. I understand, you know, they show climate change is still way and above #1 issue for a lot of farmers.
Yeah.
Water security is #2. The concerns around the transmission lines are pretty minuscule. Now, this is amongst
and there are very small
farmers
numbers of people who are directly affected by
I should clarify what I was saying, though. I'm not just talking about the transmission lines. I'm also talking about the actual wind and solar projects.
Oh, that's a different.
So there's
thing.
two elements to this, but they both feed into, you know, how we're going to become a renewable country, a renewable superpower.
And the Nats particularly pushing pretty hard against all of this.
Absolutely. And yes, it is communities divided, but it's also something the Nationals are harnessing, and they're bringing those voices to the surface. And it is causing huge division in communities, and it is stopping some projects from proceeding.
A lot of people want the jobs that come in these communities, want the jobs that will come from the construction of this stuff.
But is this resistance from the Nats going to make it harder for the Libs, the coalition generally, James, to stick with net zero by 2050 and have a clear policy at the next election?
Oh, look, I don't know. I mean, the coalition is all in on nuclear, right? And if you talk to Labor MPs, there's actually a bit of dismay at how hard Chris Bowen is arguing against nuclear. They say he doesn't need to whack it into, you know, next week. You know, next year Britain is going to award something like £20 billion £20 billion worth of contracts to start building small modular reactors. 6 of them around the country. They power about 300,000 homes as opposed to 3 million homes. You know, the argument goes we should be we being Labor, neutralising this, saying that's not the right option for Australia. Instead, he's absolutely attacking the coalition.
Is it a fantasy wrapped in a
bubble? I think that's overblown rhetoric, and you know, I think Peter Dutton's sort of harnessing this idea that, well, we're getting nuclear submarines, and we're there's general, relatively broad community acceptance of that. I think he's seeing that and thinking, well, that will transfer to the nuclear debate. So in terms of I mean, Dutton very clearly has been travelling through the Hunter, these seats.
If this government gets re-elected, if this government gets re-elected, it will be because of of Peter Dutton's nuclear folly.
I don't agree at all, James. I don't agree at all.
I think that the public...
It's 10 years down the track, right?
It's not going to happen in 2 years, 3 years.
If I were the Labor Party, I would be absolutely just with my fingers crossed praying that the coalition goes to an election planning to introduce nuclear power.
They will, though, won't they?
They will.
I mean,
in every single electorate, there will be DL saying, where's it going to be? Who's getting these?
Is what Anthony Albanese did very effectively.
The previous government had 10 years to do this. The science hasn't changed. The argument hasn't changed. Why didn't they do it when they were in government? Because they knew they didn't have the nuts to do it because it was politically toxic when they were in government. Do you think you can sell this from opposition? Like, it's just madness.
Yeah, I disagree. I think people are smart. I think they look at the fact we're getting nuclear subs.
And they're buying them off the shelf.
Sure, and these modular reactors, so the argument goes...
Small ones. Small ones. They're really small.
Will be off the shelf as well. Put in places like Liddell, where coal-fired power stations...
The only problem is there's plenty of plans... there's plenty of plans for these small modular reactors, but so far, and I don't even know by the next election whether any of them will be up and running and going, look, there's one that works.
They won't be.
But this is David Littleproud, the Nationals leader himself, agrees this is a 10-year down-the-track proposition. And I think one of the biggest issues that will decide public mood going into the next election will be what happens this summer. If there is a huge bushfire season, which is predicted,
I agree with that.
Climate change is deeply on the agenda. The public mood and the public appetite to have sort of theoretical arguments about possible things in the future.
Yeah.
Climate change is a weather story at the end of the day.
Yeah. And it matters to everyone.
To come back to what Chris Bowen didn't say in that interview, David, the renewable energy target, which is essentially what he's walked away from in introducing this new scheme, wasn't going to get to 82% of electricity generated from renewables by 2030. Australia has about 65 gigawatts of power in the grid, all up. This adds another 32 gigawatts, 9 of it batteries.
A lot of coal will come out, though.
Yeah, 23 of solar and wind. My point is just don't underestimate or don't downplay just how big this bet by Chris Bowen is. It's huge.
We've spent way too long talking about nuclear power. I'm sure we'll come back to that. Just a couple of quick ones. Inflation. We saw some comments, let me show you, from the Reserve Bank Governor during the week talking about what's driving inflation.
The remaining inflation challenge we're dealing with is increasingly homegrown and demand-driven. A more substantial monetary policy response, monetary policy tightening, is the right response to inflation that results from aggregate demand exceeding the economy's potential to meet that demand.
So homegrown is the key word there. The Prime Minister's still focusing on the global factors here. And there's no doubt that petrol is still, I think, what is it, the most dominant factor at the moment in the inflation figures. So what's going on? Who's right, who's wrong? Anna? A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, of course, the Reserve Bank Governor has got a lot of information at her disposal to make some fairly pointed comments to perhaps correct some of the political artifice that's been put around this issue and to maybe give some real talk about what's going on. And I think people are noticing it, and I think it's now driving this really vexed, difficult and divisive conversation around migration. Because there's this conversation that the opposition's now walking into around what is driving this domestically, that they're planning, I think, to run all the way up until the next election too.
But domestic prices, the cost of a haircut, the cost of a dentist visit, insurance, they're chasing inflation, essentially. Like that's what's dragged us to this point, David. So Michelle Bullock, of course, is correct up to a point. It is now a domestic problem. But that's a response to what we've been experiencing for 18 months.
Look, everything Michelle Bullock says about migration is bad for the government, right? Because on the one hand, she's saying migration is affecting house prices and rents. That's a disaster for the government. Well, on the other hand, she's saying, but, from an overall inflation perspective, it's not that bad. It's a mixed thing because migration also drives down wages. Now, that's also a disaster for the government.
But it also creates longer-term economic development, right? Like it also, in the long term, again, eminent people, more qualified than me, have tracked what it means when you have a big intake of migrants and they fill skill shortages and they create more jobs. So there's a longer-term and a short-term discussion.
I think the economists, the traffic in this on the research is actually starting to go the other way a bit. One of the things, if we've got a productivity crisis in our economy, right? Everyone agrees about that. Migration is not a fantastic way to improve the productivity of your economy if you're simply having to spend money on infrastructure and services and things like that for people that you're bringing in. Well, you end up chasing your own tail.
They've got the migration strategy to come before the end of the year, a mid-year budget update to come before the end of the year. A bit to go in the next few weeks. That budget update, I don't think will pour any more help into people's pockets because they don't want to make inflation problem worse. They're trying to rein in spending through infrastructure and so on. So we'll see all of that in the coming weeks. Our panel, James Massola, Anna Henderson and James Campbell, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with the host of A Rational Fear and the winner of the 2023 Australian Podcast Award for the Best Comedy Podcast.
Oh, I'm glad you brought it up. You didn't have to bring it up. I just brought the trophy so we didn't have to talk about it.
Dan, relationships with China were getting smoother, but over the last couple of weeks it seems to have hit some troubled waters.
Yeah, very choppy waters indeed, and this piece is so incredible.
Mark Knight cartoon, and I was very pleased to see that dragons can't be just red inflations, you can have blue amphibious ones in cartoons.
Yeah, this is kind of like an Australian Game of Thrones, if we had to to make one. Divers, getting rid of the net from the propeller.
It's okay, Albo says he's got it eating out of his hand. Yeah, good relations with China.
I love Mark Knight's snail.
His little kicker here.
Yeah, good relations with China. We're so near, but now so nah.
Boom, boom.
Good one, Mark.
I did love this Kathy Wilcox sees Xi Jinping here with APEC 2023, handsome boy.
And then Xi going...
A bit like that, isn't it? There's a duality to our relationship.
Well, I think there's a duality to everything. You know, you're Batman or Robin.
Dan, back on the home front, the government's been facing the coalition of the unwilling with No, 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 No. Lovely Brolman cartoon who's got Anthony Albanese and his assistant here with sonar.
I do like how Peter Dutton is forewarned with his own sonar of going, no, no, no.
As the Dutch shark here is rising row over Chinese Navy sonar injuries.
Yeah.
John Shakespeare, the new mantra, it's not jobs.
No, it's not jobs, 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 it's...
Jabs, jabs, jabs.
I really enjoy this picture. Look, I don't know if that's Toto or if that's Pistol or Boo still in immigration detention.
Lovely Mark David cartoon.
Yeah, well, we've got Dutton here saying, we need strict limits to the movements of those who inspire fear in the community. Not funny, Albo.
She's got the ball and chain and the ankle bracelet.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really interesting that Miles, while Albo was away, took on all of the coalition's suggestions. They should just merge the Liberal and Labor Party to be one party. Think of the cost savings.
The Laboral Party.
The Laboral Party.
Yeah. Dan, it's the story of the inflation dragon versus the blunt instrument, and it still hasn't come to a happy ending. But David Rowe, in his beautiful way, seems to have summed matters up here quite graphically.
You can trust David Rowe to make something so grotesque out of a very basic financial story, can't you?
Yeah.
A couple of things I'd like to point out about here. You've got the ball catching here.
Yeah.
You've got the sphincter.
Yep.
I love that sphincter. The tongue.
Yep.
And you've got a periscope.
Yep.
For the submarine.
Is there a science to the examination of inflation dragon scat, do you think?
I'm not too sure. I hear if you rub it on your face, it's good for your skin.
Dan, climate scientists might sound like a broken record, but temperature records keep on being broken.
Yeah, well, it's no wonder they're feeling a bit glum and need to go to a climate scientist support group.
Yeah, Fiona Katauskas, I just feel like nobody listens to me or cares about what I have to say.
Tell me about it.
The way that David Pope always does, he just draws together these very complicated things in such a way that it hits you in the face like a brick wrapped in a sponge.
Yep, it is a COP time and it's being held in Dubai.
Yep.
We've got this cartoon here. It says paved with intentions. It says welcome to the climate summit. Everything is green except for anywhere where there's not a sign. I love this here, 1.5 degrees. And that's flying away because that target has flown away too.
Yep.
Not only is it titled paved with intentions, the thing that it is being paved with is fossil fuel expansion plans.
Yeah. Dan, you were at the Walkleys event this year and Badu Chow won Cartoon of the Year for a body of work that he's done. He's a great addition to the Australian cartooning environment.
Yeah, totally. And I saw him at the Walkleys and he looked very stoked to take his Walkley Award home with him, and he said he's going to send it to his mum because he doesn't get to go to China very often.
Right. It's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week, even though it's a little bit depressing.
Well, that's my brand.
I'll let you do the honours.
Back to you, David Speers.
Thank you, Dan Illich. Thank you, Mike Bowes. Let's get some final observations. James.
Anthony Albanese has spent time over the weekend working on a speech he'll deliver on Wednesday, the Whitlam oration. It will look at the current challenges facing the government, but it will also cast ahead to next year, which is where his mind and that of Peter Dutton both already turning. Dutton, for his part, next year expect to see announcements, flesh on the bone in terms of housing policy, energy policy and more. It'll be a year of detail.
All right. We look forward to that, Anna.
The Federal Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and the Northern Territory Attorney General are essentially in crisis talks at the moment over Alice Springs. We know that's been a focus of the referendum campaign, particularly the crime rate there. We're leading into summer, a very high crime period traditionally, and the Indigenous Legal Service in Alice Springs has had such an exodus of staff for a myriad of reasons that they have had to shut their doors to new clients. So we're going to see people for whom English might be a third or fourth language, potentially representing themselves in court, and the fear is they could end up with a longer sentence or imprisonment when they're not actually supposed to, if they had legal representation, go into jail.
Yeah. James.
There's a rumour going around the building that just doesn't seem to want to go away, which is that the Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, is getting itchy feet and might be ready to leave us.
Oh, he's going to leave that hanging there.
Yeah.
We'll see the veracity of that one.
It's only a rumour.
Rumour.
Yeah.
That's all good. We appreciate all of you joining us this morning. Thanks so much for that. Look, finally, ABC Radio Sydney marked 100 years on air during the week, and the Prime Minister joined in the celebrations. He hailed the virtues of radio as a medium for serious conversations about complex issues, unlike some of the rubbish on social media. But turns out it wasn't his only appearance on the wireless that morning. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Radio gives you a chance to actually have a conversation. And, you know, politics isn't about just a grab. You know, issues are complex. They need to be talked through.
I don't mean to pry here, but when you're staying at the White House with your other half, you've got to, You've got to,
Chris in the room.
You've got to,
what goes on tour stays on tour.
You've got to have some of these couple memories.
You surely know that.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.